Hello, I'm Jeff Nichols. I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm very happy to have Dr. Drew Gilpin Faust here with us today to talk about her latest piece in the Atlantic, the December 2023 issue, called The Men Who Started the War, principally about John Brown's raid and the Secret Six. Dr. Drew Gilpin Faust is President Emerita of Harvard University and Arthur Kingsley Porter University Research Professor at Harvard. She is the author of 7 books, including most recently Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century, which is a New York Times bestseller. And in 2008, she published The Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War, which chronicles the impact of the Civil War's enormous death toll on the lives of 19th century Americans. And I read that book, and it's a hard book to read for sure, but and really an amazing story. So welcome, Drew.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. This is a great issue, the December issue of the Atlantic, because it's really talking about Reconstruction and topics of the Civil War, and of course, an amazing publication to begin with, being around in the Civil War, so the connections are so deep. But you chose to write about John Brown's raid, but specifically about the Secret Six. Why did you choose to write about that part of John Brown's raid?
Well, it really began with an interest I have in Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who is one of the Secret Six. And he always seemed to me to put himself on the right side of questions in the Civil War era. He was a abolitionist and an opponent of the fugitive slave law, and he risked his life trying to free individuals who'd been seized in Boston under the terms of the fugitive slave law to be shipped back to slavery. And he was very both vehement and risk-taking in regard to that. He also commanded the first unit of Black troops in the Civil War itself. After the war, he was a big proponent of women's rights. And I've spent so much of my life writing about white Southerners who were proponents of slavery or who had enslaved people on their properties and so forth, that I just got interested in someone who seemed to put himself on the right side of the slavery question in so many instances. So as I began thinking about Higginson and figuring out how much of a role he'd played in the Secret Six and some of the ways he talked about this effort, I thought that writing about that and about what John Brown's raid meant was a logical outcome, and to think about the questions of violence that are so central to this and to our understanding of how the Civil War came, but more broadly to the place of violence in American history, and when is it justified and when is it not, and are there any clear lines, and who do we understand to have been on the right or wrong side of those questions over time.
And you also have a bit of a personal connection. You start the piece off by talking about your childhood in, I guess, Western Virginia, and traveling to Harpers Ferry. Can you talk a little bit about that and your experience as a child? And of course, you kind of hint on how that changes, but what you heard as a youngster growing up there in Virginia.
Well, we often drove by Harpers Ferry because it was right on the road that we took to go to see my grandparents in New Jersey. We go along Route 340 and then up, by Baltimore and up into New Jersey. And so that pathway or road right along the cliffs, the very dramatic view of the Shenandoah and the Potomac coming together below us, was always something that had quite a presence in my childhood and in my life. And from early on, we were told this story about John Brown's raid, and that's where it had happened. And he was just designated as a crazy person in those stories. This was this madman who thought he could liberate all the slaves in the South, and made this effort to capture the engine house and capture hostages. And we'd look down and see where it had all happened. And it was like a stage set in a way, because the geography there is so dramatic anyway. And then to think about this great adventure happening. My older brother was a big Civil War buff when we were growing up in the Shenandoah Valley. There's an awful lot of that, and
Yes, there is.
a lot of things to look at and see. Sheridan and Jackson and Turner Ashby and Mosby were all racing around. So we played Civil War a lot as children. And my brother began collecting Civil War guns and weaponry. And he got supposedly a John Brown's pike. Now,
Ah,
whether this was actually an original piece, I don't know. He eventually sold it, and it was bought as an original piece. But that also was present in our household. So the great long pike with a kind of knife-like top, that also made an impression on a young child growing up in the 50s and 60s as well.
yeah, I imagine it does. And in fact, in our collection, we have one of the spearheads from one of the original pikes in our collection. So if you ever come to the museum, maybe you'll have a flashback to your childhood
Good,
by seeing
good.
that. So we'll take a step back from that and get into some of the causes the issues that led up to John Brown taking action. And you briefly talked about the Fugitive Slave Act and a few other pieces, but can you lay the groundwork from the political action that happened in the early 1850s that led up to John Brown making his decision, and also the Secret Six for joining in?
Well, I think the essential element here, I mean, I don't want to recite the entire history of the 1850s, but from the point of view of those of the Secret Six, who were these very reputable Boston Brahmins. There was one person, very wealthy man from New York, but these were, very respectable individuals from pretty high station, either intellectually high station or in terms of wealth in Northern society. But they became increasingly frustrated during the 1850s that slavery was being made a national institution. The fugitive slave law said that individuals who had escaped from slavery to the North and had escaped enslavement were subject to being taken without a jury trial back to the South. And indeed, bounties were available to those who did the seizing and returning. So there was almost a motivation to find individuals, and sometimes find individuals who had never been enslaved in the first place. So this seemed extraordinarily unjust, and it was taking place on the streets of northern cities. It wasn't just that slavery was down there somewhere. Instead, there it was right in the middle of New York and of Boston. So that seemed to put a different tone on the whole relationship of the North to the slave institution. And then with the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court about an individual who was suing for his freedom from Missouri, saying that he had a right to be free because of being transported outside of a state that legally supported slavery. That also reinforced the sense on the part of Northerners that the situation of slavery was never going to be resolved peacefully, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, said that a Black man had no rights that whites ever were obliged to recognize, that African Americans could not be citizens. And the kind of racist division and the indelibility of that division that was enshrined in that Supreme Court decision also became intolerable in the minds of Northerners. Meanwhile, in Kansas, the fight over whether Kansas would be admitted as a free or a slave state turned from a legislative fight or a political fight into a warlike fight, in which John Brown and his sons were actually actively engaged, fighting against the establishment of a pro-slavery constitution and a pro-slavery state in Kansas. And so the model of intervention through violence was kind of tried out in Kansas in the 1850s. And the Secret Six began their involvement with John Brown through supporting him in Kansas. And my friend Thomas Wentworth Higginson himself went out there and kind of played at war a little bit and was very swept up in the possibilities and the allure of violent intervention with the slave institution. So I'd say, I mean, there are many more things that went on in the 1850s, but I think those are some of the ones that were most influential in radicalizing the Secret Six. They came to think that only violence, not peaceful legislative resolution, was going to overturn slavery.
And a few of those men were involved in the various Kansas aid committees, which were the groups that were
Yes.
formed within the northern states to help fund the free state settlers in that fight.
Yes.
And it was from out of that a few of them met John Brown and also then began forming the Secret Six. And you obviously, from the way you wrote the story, Thomas Wentworth Higginson really does play a central role in all of this. Can you give us a little more detail about him? He clearly was sort of the man of action of this group and one of those who seemed to me never repented after the war about having made thinking it in any way was a bad decision. So can you go a little bit more in detail on him and his legacy?
Yes, he grew up in Cambridge. His father was the bursar for Harvard College, which meant he kind of provided food and other things that students needed. Um, his father died when Wentworth, he was called by his middle name, when Wentworth was a boy, but Wentworth remained in Cambridge, went to Harvard College, then he went to Harvard Divinity School, and he had a pulpit on the North Shore of Massachusetts soon after he graduated from Divinity School. And this was in the North for sure, but it was a port city in which there were many individuals who were involved in the trade with the South, the cotton trade, other kinds of interactions with slave society in the South that were very profitable for these merchants. So when Thomas Wentworth Higginson started preaching vehemently against slavery, he more or less was fired from his job, and he went to be a minister in a congregation in Worcester. That was a very radical congregation and much more welcoming of his extreme views about abolition and the intensity of his commitment to abolition. And so that's kind of where Higginson came from. Part of why I found him so interesting is he just had a kind of level of commitment and also a way with words where he would capture certain elements of what was going on. And my article has a number of those quotations that I hope were engaging and interesting. But one of my favorite stories about Higginson is he had a wife who was very ill for many years, and he nursed her and took care of her. And she died, and this is a decade or so after the Civil War. And he remarries, and he takes his wife for their honeymoon. And this is well after Harpers Ferry. The Civil War is over with. I can't remember the exact date of this marriage, but anyway, it is after, I guess, in the middle of Reconstruction. But he decides for his honeymoon, he's going to take his wife to Harpers Ferry and show her all the sights of where John Brown was. And he's obviously still completely involved in this matter of support for Harpers Ferry. And so I thought, what a story for a honeymoon. I wonder what his wife thought about that. But in a way, he was more married to the whole memory of Harpers Ferry and John Brown than he was to his wife. So that it represents his failure ever to repent or reject the effort. Others in the Secret Six, first of all, out of fear, I think, that they would be prosecuted when it was discovered that they had supported this insurrection, fled the country, hoping to remain safe from imprisonment or arrest. Thomas Wentworth Higginson never moved. He said, I'm here. I believe in John Brown. I'm not going to reject what he did. I think it was the right thing to do. And in fact, Higginson tried to rescue, came up with these plans or tried to develop actionable plans to rescue John Brown after he was imprisoned. He decided that wasn't possible, and he didn't execute on it, but he thought about it at least and talked to others and tried to raise money to rescue John Brown, even after the raid had failed.
And that's, I think it's Higginson and then Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, the two that seem to have the most to say in defense of John Brown after the failure of the insurrection in October of 1859 and post-war. Can you talk about a little bit about his role? And I think he wrote some 75 articles in defense of John Brown post-war.
Many of which were in the Atlantic, which was a kind
Right,
of
which
nice,
is so
nice
fascinating about
touch.
that magazine.
Yeah. The Atlantic's been writing about John Brown for a long time. Franklin Sanborn was a schoolmaster in Concord, Massachusetts, and he became very swept up in the John Brown planning and so forth. Also, obviously, a strong abolitionist. He wrote extensively about Brown after the war, but evidently, John Brown told him he had not been involved in direct violence against civilians. There's a famous event that takes place during the Kansas upheavals called the Potawatomi Massacre, where John Brown's family, his sons, and he were involved in the slaughter of a family of individuals who had not been fighting in the battles in Kansas themselves. It was women and a young boy all killed. And John Brown told Sanborn that he had had no role in this. And that was a lie. And Sanborn didn't realize until really the 1870s that John Brown had misrepresented things to him. So Sanborn gave a kind of spirited defense of Brown, but minimizing some of the realities of Brown's behavior, both in Kansas and minimizing the role of violence in the raid. So Sanborn was kind of in a world of his own making about who John Brown had been and justified him unreservedly, but justified him as a person that he really wasn't. Higginson confronted, admitted the violence, and remained supportive of John Brown and his raid in full recognition of the dimensions of what had been involved.
That's it's very interesting, the different takes they had. And you mentioned obviously the raid happens, it fails, John Brown is executed. And we actually in our collection have the pen that was used by the governor to sign the death warrant, which is another an amazing piece, an artifact that we have here. But shortly thereafter, there are letters that are discovered from some of the Secret Six, of course, the folks who financed this raid, and that's where some of the trouble begins. And some of the other men who may not have covered themselves in glory, at least I'm sure Higginson thought so. And you have a great quote from Higginson about that, and he says, "Well, we of the six are not great men," and he viewed obviously John Brown as a great man. So can you talk a little bit about the aftermath? What happened to some of the other members of the committee?
Higginson thought that his fellow conspirators were very cowardly, and several of them, as I mentioned earlier, fled and went to Canada, hoping to escape arrest. They had a lawyer they were consulting with in Boston who first said, "I don't think they can prosecute you," then and so then they came back. And then he developed a more nuanced understanding, he thought, of what they might be subject to legally, and said, "Whoops, maybe you better go again." So they went back to Canada again. Gerrit Smith, who was the wealthy donor from New York, one of the wealthiest men in the state of New York, had what we might call a nervous breakdown, just a complete emotional collapse, and was checked into the Utica Lunatic Asylum. And he really, his mental health remained fragile for the rest of his life, even though he didn't spend the whole time in the asylum. When he came out, he would hear none of any discussion about John Brown. He didn't want it even mentioned in his presence because he said it would send him back into paroxysms of mental undoing. So they really backed off from, in one way or another, either through efforts to escape legal peril or through this claim of insanity on the part of Gerrit Smith. They backed off from supporting John Brown. There was a committee appointed in Congress to investigate, which was chaired by a congressman from Virginia, James Mason, who had ironically or perhaps horrifyingly been the author of, or one of the main authors of, the Fugitive Slave Law. But this committee called several of the members of the Secret Six to testify. They misrepresented, they lied, they evaded, they didn't really confess to the full measure of their involvement. They were fearful to go to Washington to testify because they thought they might be seized by Virginians, kidnapped,
Mm.
and taken into, custody by violent guerrilla type individuals. This did not happen to them. Higginson was never asked, much to his disappointment, to testify. He was ready to go down and give a robust defense. And the fact that he wasn't asked to testify is perhaps a bit of a explanation, or gives a bit of understanding into why this committee of the Congress was so tepid and kind of abandoned its inquiries. And what I would speculate is that Mason realized that he was giving a platform to a lot of abolitionist voices, and he decided, I'm not going to prosecute these people. I'm not going to push this too far, because all we're going to do is have a lot of abolitionists holding forth in the public arena. So that kind of faded out. But the raid, as you said, was in October of 59. In the following spring, in April of 1860, some federal marshals came out to Concord to try to seize Franklin Sanborn in order to get him to testify and perhaps to prosecute him. And the citizens of Concord rose up to protect him against the federal marshals, and a sympathetic judge who lived nearby issued a writ of habeas corpus, and Franklin Sanborn became a great hero, and there was a big celebration that he had been saved from the federal marshals. And of course, Concord, Massachusetts was the home to some pretty prominent American intellectuals, Emerson, Thoreau. Thoreau got up and spoke at this celebration. And so, as perhaps James Mason feared, every effort against these Secret Six just resulted in the increasing prominence and mobilization of support for them in the North, at least. So none of them was ever punished, imprisoned, anything of that sort in the aftermath of the controversy. Of the raid.
Yeah, well, I found it to be a fascinating story. I didn't know all of these details, obviously, and the individuals involved. And then the final part of your story, of your article, is talking about the legacy of John Brown and this raid, and bringing it up to this very day. And you mentioned early in this conversation the history of violence in our nation as part of that founding myth, I guess, or founding actions that were taken. Can you talk a little bit about how other people have used John Brown's legacy over time? And then
Sure.
what that legacy is today.
Yeah, and I think I should add something else that I've omitted so far, which is to talk about Frederick Douglass, who was
Yes.
not one of the Secret Six, was urged by John Brown to supply support, and he knew John Brown very well. John Brown had spent time living in his house, working on a constitution for this new state he has hoped to establish in the South after his raid. So they knew each other well. But I think Frederick Douglass had a much more realistic assessment of what was at risk here. These aristocratic Brahmins who made up the Secret Six, in some level, could not imagine that they would ever be held accountable for this behavior. Whereas Frederick Douglass knew all too well that, first of all, he'd be suspected immediately. And secondly, the full measure of the law would, if not worse, would come right down on his head. So he did not actively participate. He fled to England for over a year after the raid happened in order to ensure his own safety. But I think when we think about Frederick Douglass and violence, Frederick Douglass had come in the course of the 1850s to recognize that it would only be violence that could ultimately destroy slavery. And he, in some ways, traced violence back. He said, where's violence been? And it really, slave system was in itself a measure of violence. Violence was already there because slavery as a system was inherently based on violence. And that, I think, segues into your question about how people have tried to grapple with John Brown's raid ever since. And it has been a matter of considerable celebration in the Black community for years after John Brown, after the war and after John Brown's death. It involved festivals honoring John Brown. It involved the effort of the NAACP to put a plaque honoring John Brown at a African-American college that was established in Harpers Ferry after the war. W.B. Du Bois spoke very positively and gave us a famous speech about John. He wrote a biography of John Brown. Frederick Douglass gave a marvelous speech about John Brown and why he was a hero. And then in art, John Brown has been taken up in the African American community as well, with things like Jacob Lawrence's magnificent series about John Brown. So there's a long tradition of honoring John Brown as the person who stepped up to oppose slavery and risked his life and died and became a martyr for slavery. In the white community of America, I think there's been somewhat different reactions in that he's been dubbed, I think the overwhelming interpretation is the guy was crazy, that to think slavery ought to be overthrown by violence, you got to be crazy. So I talk about that. That was certainly how John Brown was explained to me when I was growing up. But even into our own time, I mean, Obama has spoken positively about John Brown. Interestingly, Martin Luther King never did, even when he was invited to a ceremony that was meant to honor John Brown and an anniversary of his raid. King spoke without mentioning John Brown.
And that's a philosophical difference in how to approach resistance.
I mean, his fervent devotion to nonviolence. And then we see we're still captured by, that's a metaphoric use, but maybe it's accurate. Captured by John Brown in things like Good Lord Bird, which was just on TV last year, or Russell Banks's novel Cloud Splitter. So that he is an echo in our lives. Where is violence? Where is justice? How do we ally them, or how do they go together? And I suggest, and I say in my essay, that we are a nation that was born in violence in the Revolution. We maintained our unity as a nation through enormous violence in the Civil War. We have members of Congress wearing AR-15 pins in their lapels today. What is our understanding of the relationship between violence and the rule of law and civil society? I don't think we've ever resolved it. And I think that the fascination with John Brown is an emblem of that confusion and conflict within our national identity and within our society more broadly.
Well, I think that is a good place for us to wrap up this conversation, and a good summation of your article in the December issue of The Atlantic. If you're not a subscriber to The Atlantic, I suggest you be so. It's a wonderful magazine. And also within the story, you can link back to some of the original articles that were in the Atlantic back in the 1860s. And so it's a fascinating read and a fascinating archive of American history. And also, of course, if you like this video, please become a member of the National Civil War Museum as well. We could definitely use your support as a 501c3 nonprofit. Drew, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today to discuss this wonderful story and this important and enduring American legacy. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
John Brown's body lies a moldering in